In the Appalachian Plateaus of Georgia, on a summit called Pigeon Mountain, there is a cave that is known for having dozens of rescues over the years and multiple serious incidents. It's the most dangerous cave in the state of Georgia, and many serious incidents inside of it seem to have similar underlying problems. And today, I'm going to tell you about 4 of them. I'm Tatiana Bunch, and this is Occurrence. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information. Without further ado, Ellison's cave is a pit cave. In other parts of the world, it's called a pothole or a pot, but it's a type of cave that has at least one significant vertical shaft inside. Unlike the usual horizontal cave passage, pits can also be found inside of horizontal caves. Pits usually require ropes or ladders to navigate them, and that brings me to the first incident. Harold Allen, who goes by Hal Buford, was a 28-year-old adventurer who wanted to explore the passages below a pit named the Incredible Pit in Ellison's cave. He brought 2 friends for this trip, 27-year-old Chris Andrews and 25-year-old Anthony Bates. They started their descent on a Tuesday morning, completely unaware of what would happen over the next few hours. They entered through the stair-step entrance, descending an initial 80-foot pit, followed by an 83-foot pit, before facing the 440-foot or 134-meter deep Incredible Pit. And that's actually not the deepest pit in Ellison's cave. The deepest is almost 600 feet deep and on the opposite side of Ellison's from where they were. The cave itself has several challenging pits inside, but it also has shallow pits, like the warm-up pit, which will come up later on. But for your reference, Ellison's cave is 12 miles or 19 kilometers long and 1,063 feet deep or 324 meters. The pits have waterfalls with varying amounts of water flowing down them. There was a sizable stream forming a waterfall down the entire length of the Incredible Pit. When the friends arrived, there was already a half-inch rope from a previous group, and they rigged their own 7/16-inch rope beside it. They did not remove it. One by one, they made their way down, and after spending time exploring below, they decided it was time to head back up. It was late Tuesday evening, March 10th, 1999. Anthony and Chris ascended first without any problems. Hal was the last to start his climb around 11:30 p.m. Things were going smoothly until he was about 150 feet up. That's when trouble kicked in. Around midnight, Hal started yelling for help. But with the noise from the waterfall and the deep pit, his friends couldn't quite communicate with him. After they lost contact, Anthony and Chris rushed out of the cave to get help. They called emergency dispatch around 2:30 a.m., and cave rescue teams were notified shortly after that. By 9 a.m., 35 volunteer rescuers entered the cave. Some descended to the top of the Incredible Pit and were calling out to Hal. Some were supporting from other positions in the cave. None of the rescuers calling Hal got a response. Knowing this was a bad sign, especially since his friends lost communication with him hours earlier, they moved quickly. Using ropes and pulleys, they rigged a system to haul him up, only to find he had already passed away. He had actually been gone for several hours at that point. Rescuers found Hal hanging about 150 feet above the bottom of the cave. His setup suggested that he had tried to switch from climbing to rappelling, but got stuck. He had one ascender on each rope, both under tension. He was using a handled ascender, and that is a tool cavers use to attach to their rope. Its overall shape and size is similar to a carabiner to me, but it's thinner and flatter in some parts of it. On one side, it has a handle that they hold on to, and at the top, there's a hole to feed the rope through a mechanism that grips the rope, only allowing it to move upwards. This helps cavers climb up vertical or steep ropes in caves. Hal's rappel rack was rigged on the half-inch rope under his handle descender. A rappel rack is a metal J-frame with bars that cavers attach to their harness. It reminds me of a mini handheld ladder, so picture that. The kind that extends to lean up against the side of your house to climb to the roof, not the one that folds in half and when you open it, it's like stairs and you use it to change light bulbs and reach high shelves inside. Anyway, it has the two main support bars parallel to each other. One side longer at the bottom than the other, and at the top it rounds and connects, so it's like an upside down letter J. It has bars across like the rungs on a ladder, and they can open on one side to weave rope through, forwards and backwards, before closing it again. The bars can be moved closer together or further apart to speed up or slow down going down a rope. Unfortunately, it seemed like Hal couldn't transfer his weight to the rappel rack, probably because of exhaustion and the cold, both of which made him pass out. The official cause of death was hypothermia and positional asphyxia, a condition where the body position restricts airflow, which can also be called suspension trauma. So the cold temperatures and exhaustion made him lose consciousness. And then the position he was hanging in his harness, cut off his airflow. It also seemed as if the ropes, which were rigged close together, became tangled. Because even though Chris and Anthony didn't have problems ascending, Hal did. Though it is noted that it's unclear if the tangling happened before or after Hal's passing. The equipment also played a role. Hal was using Petzl ascenders designed for ropes up to 7/16 inch in diameter, and they don't run as smoothly on those thicker ropes. That, along with him being cold and exhausted, might have caused him to switch back to rappelling and go back down to the bottom. But to survive these types of conditions requires quick gear changes. You have to be able to switch from rappelling to climbing and vice versa quickly. Being able to do either change is something cavers should be able to do in less than 5 minutes. And if you practice, which you should, you can do it in under 1 minute. Being able to do that is a basic and essential skill for anyone doing vertical caving. Hal's clothes didn't help either. With the water pouring down around them at 35 degrees, normally cavers would wear a full wetsuit or a PVC nylon caving jumpsuit over long layered thermal wear. But Hal, he was wearing a plastic rain suit over denim overalls, a cotton thermal undershirt, and a cotton work shirt. And that just isn't enough to prevent hypothermia. During the time of year when this happened, the waterfall was also near its peak. It's flowing there pretty much year-round, with the amount varying depending on the time of year. So knowing that, his choice for cotton clothing was not a good choice at all, because it absorbs water and holds it against the skin. This would increase the risk of hypothermia. With cotton, people's survival time in water is just minutes. A wetsuit would have given him a better chance at surviving and given him more time to arrange his equipment. And his plastic rain suit wasn't a good choice either, simply because it's not sturdy enough for the cave environment. Sadly, this incident was the first death in Ellison's cave, and George's first caving fatality since 1967. The second story takes place in the same cave in 2011. On February 12th, 10 men and women from the University of Florida's Fellowship of Christian Athletes decided to visit Ellison's cave for a day of exploring and rappelling. It was 5 men and 5 women. They were actually there to celebrate the president of the group's birthday. His name was Grant, and he was turning 21 that weekend. The group made it to Georgia the day before and spent the night at a hotel nearby. Once they made it to the mountains, they split into 2 groups, one to explore the horizontal sections of Ellison's cave, and the other to rappel down a 125-foot deep pit known as the warm-up pit. They all spent time together at a creek before the groups ventured off. Some people in the group had experienced caving and had been to Ellison's cave before, and others were first-timers. After a while, the first group joined their friends at the warm-up pit. It was time to start wrapping things up, but the second group was saying they couldn't leave quite yet. At some point, somehow, before the second group even started rappelling, someone in the group lost a bag and a rope. They dropped their backpack over the edge of one of the underground cliffs. So Grant grabbed another rope that they had and scaled down a 150-foot drop to get the fallen backpack. Reports are unclear on exactly what happened, but at some point on the way down, Grant ran into trouble and started calling for help. The other students couldn't hear him clearly, but they could tell that he was distressed. So half of the group exited the cave to call for help, while 3 women and another student named Michael stayed at the pit. I'm assuming it was the first group that left for help while the second group stayed. Emergency services received a call at 2:19 p.m., and a cave rescue unit was immediately dispatched. Within the hour, an initial response team made up of 3 people were on their way up the mountain, carrying equipment to help Grant. They were planning to lower him down to the bottom of the pit and then lift him back out. Within 30 minutes, the initial response team managed to hike a 1-mile trail with a 850-foot elevation and went into the cave. At the same time, other teams were also assembling to support the rescue. There were teams for rigging, communication, and evacuation. When the initial response team reached the pit, they found the 3 women. They were cold and wet and dressed only in shorts and t-shirts with knee pads and headlamps. The women immediately told them that Michael rappelled down to Grant using the same rope, and he became distressed as well. Michael started yelling for help too, and there was some communication, but after 20 to 30 minutes, Grant and Michael's voices faded away. The women then left the cave to be treated for mild to moderate hypothermia, and rescuers now knew there were 2 people in need of help. Grant and Michael rigged their ropes directly in the waterfall. This pit, like many of them do, also had a waterfall. The sound of the rushing water was making communication difficult, so the response team didn't waste any time and rigged a rope out of the waterfall, beside it. And one of the rescuers rappelled down to the 2 friends who were around 40 feet from the bottom. Unfortunately, the rescuer's rope was too far to swing over to them and reach them, so he tried shouting very loudly to them, but he received no response. And then the rescuer made his way back to the top of the pit as more help arrived. The teams rigged and prepared to lower the men, getting them away from the water so they could treat them, getting them to a point where they can get them out of the pit. So a different rescuer from the initial response team rappelled directly into the waterfall to secure them to the lowering line. He was successful, and once Grant and Michael were lowered, an EMT examined both of them. Grant was a senior sociology major and was a wrestler in high school. He loved playing sports and doing anything challenging, and he wanted to join the military after he graduated college. Michael was a marketing freshman, and both Grant and Michael were described as being selfless and having a lot of love for people. Sadly, Grant and Michael were found deceased. A haul system was used to lift them out of the pit, one at a time, and both were removed from the cave by 8:30 p.m. The cause of death was determined to be hypothermia. During the investigation, an inventory of their gear showed they lacked the experience and proper equipment for this pit, especially with being inside of the waterfall and feeling its full force. Grant wore a hand-tied seat harness without a helmet, light, or gloves. And the gear he used to attach himself to his rope and how he had the gear attached to his person was wrong. Michael had a commercially sewn harness and an ATC device, which helps with going down a rope and slowing or stopping falls. It could also be used to help another person on the rope. But he didn't have any ascending gear, so he couldn't get back up. His helmet dangled from a string with the chin strap open. He also had no gloves. And both men did not have enough lighting, but a headlamp was found later on a ledge near where they were stuck, and a small light was found at the bottom of the pit. Neither of them were dressed like they should have been taught to before going into the cave. Both Grant and Michael were only wearing t-shirts and cotton shorts, which sped up the hypothermia. The water temperature that day was a high 30s to low 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is around 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. This incident turned into a double fatality when it did not have to. I can't imagine how Michael felt having to sit by and wait, knowing his friend was suffering, but he just did not have the experience or equipment to help and should have waited. One of the first rules of cave rescue is do not become a patient yourself. And this incident showed just how easily that can happen. The next incident comes 2 years later. In May of 2013, a group of cavers named Troy, John, Ed Jr., and Dwight planned an adventurous day at Ellison's cave. They entered through the stair-step entrance, heading for the incredible pit, intending to do a crossover trip with another group. The incredible pit is 440 feet deep, and they got started around 10 a.m. The group they were planning with entered from the fantastic pit side, which is 586 feet deep and on the opposite side of Ellison's cave. They were planning to descend down the pits on the side they entered the cave at and journey through the lower levels, then cross over / pass each other and exit by climbing up the other pit. A bit before 3:30 p.m., Dwight, who was making his third trip to Ellison's, lost control while using an 8-foot hand line. A hand line is a knotted rope or webbing that has loops to assist in climbing. Cavers use it to help them climb or descend in caves. They grip it with their hands for extra balance and support, especially in areas where there aren't any good footholds or handholds. It's like a temporary handrail in the cave. When Dwight lost control on the handrail, he fell and disappeared down a hole. That hole was about 40 feet deep. He was the last one to climb up, so his friends were already at the top of where they were climbing. They screamed for him, but there was no response. So Troy decided to rush out of the cave through the fantastic pit side to call for help. He was the trip leader, so he felt it was on him to do that. John and Ed stayed behind and managed to find a way to Dwight after about 20 minutes of searching for a route. They found him unconscious, and he had been that way for about 15 minutes. They quickly examined him and realized he had a severe head laceration. It looked like he had a basal skull fracture. His face was swollen, his ribs were very tender, and his left leg was bent at an unnatural angle. They examined him a bit more and realized his left femur was actually fractured, and he had an open wound that was bleeding heavily. So John and Ed worked quickly to improvise materials to stop the bleeding and try and stabilize Dwight's leg. They padded a rappel rack and held it in place using tubular webbing to stabilize his femur. They wrapped Dwight in a plastic bag to try and keep his body temperature up, and they consoled him. Meanwhile, Troy called 911 once he made his way out of the cave, which was about 2 hours after Dwight's fall. The first rescue units arrived at the mountain base at 6:32 p.m. and entered the cave at 9:15 p.m. after some delays. The cave entrance they used is about 1 mile up the mountain and is only accessible by a steep walking trail that takes around 40 minutes to walk. If they drive, there's a slightly longer rugged road that takes around 20 minutes if you're on an ATV. The incident commander didn't know what condition Dwight was in, though, and wanted to wait for cavers that were familiar with the area to arrive on scene and help. Once everyone made their way inside, the rescue teams re-rigged the ropes and descended to Dwight with the necessary medical and rescue equipment. They got communication systems set up, which were wired field phones from the entrance to the top of Fantastic Pit. Walkie-talkies were used inside of the pit to communicate. They also had a second phone line running from the bottom of the pit to Dwight. They administered IV fluids, pain medication, antibiotics, a unit of blood, and more to prepare Dwight for a long and complicated extraction. They continuously monitored his vitals and packed him up in a way that would give him a better chance at surviving the journey out of Ellison's cave. By almost 5 a.m., he was stable enough to be moved. The main challenge was lifting Dwight out of Fantastic Pit, which again was a 586-foot vertical section of the cave. They decided on a 1-to-1 mechanical advantage counterbalance system, so they attached a rope from what was holding Dwight to the ceiling using a pulley. From there, the rope ran across the pit to a section called the balcony. From there, a second rope was attached to bolts on the wall and dropped into the pit. The rope that dropped into the pit had a rescuer attached to a rappel rack with another rescuer attached to them from below for extra weight. And honestly, all of that was just the beginning, because they had to do another haul system, and they had to move Dwight horizontally, and they had to configure things a certain way to try and save time. It was intricate, to say the least, but it worked. By 11:45 a.m., Dwight reached warm-up pit and finally exited the cave around 12:30 p.m. He was then transported down the mountain to a waiting helicopter and taken to a hospital by 1:30 p.m. Amazingly, Dwight was rescued in just over 22 hours, which shows the rescuer's skill, coordination, and efficient planning. I mean, the nitty-gritty of this rescue, I think, was amazing. The rescue was a success, and Dwight survived the fall. He spent 5 days in intensive care at a level 1 trauma center. But even after he made it to the hospital, the operation wasn't finished. There were still rescuers in the lower cave levels, and they had to ascend ropes and assist with removing huge amounts of wet and muddy equipment. There were 106 people working the rescue. 71 of them were inside the cave. The complete operation couldn't be officially wrapped up until 7:41 p.m. on Monday, the 27th of May. The problem this time was the fact that the handline was a fixture in the cave, and it wasn't something brought by the cavers. It had been used countless times, and many experienced cavers would have done the same thing that the group did. It was set up over a short drop, but that short drop was on top of another drop with a 40-foot fall. The knots and loops used for climbing on the handline made it impossible for any ascending or descent gear to be used. Amazingly, 4 months after the rescue, Dwight was able to walk his daughter down the aisle at her wedding. The next story happened in 2016. On March 26th, 2 men entered Ellison's cave. They were friends. One was 22, I'll call him X. The other friend, I'll call Q. The friends had been in Ellison's cave for about 7 hours now and were preparing to leave. They had to climb out of the Fantastic Pit first, though. That's the one that keeps coming up. That's almost 600 feet deep. X hadn't been feeling his best toward the end of the trip, but it was time to go now, so they prepared to head out. X got about 100 feet up the rope and suddenly began feeling way worse. He was feeling very ill. Exhaustion quickly caught up to him, likely due to being dehydrated, and he found himself stuck. The climbing system they were using wasn't efficient, and it made things especially difficult in the state that X was in. Q realized how much trouble X was having and climbed up to him to do a pick-off and lower him back to the bottom. A pick-off is usually with a team of cavers or rescuers using ropes and pulleys to lift someone injured or stuck out of a difficult spot in a cave. It's a carefully planned and coordinated vertical rescue operation. It's usually 2 to 4 people doing it, and it's very risky and can be dangerous. They're considered highly complex and highly complicated maneuvers that don't happen often. And since they aren't used a lot by the average caver, the ability to do it successfully drops. You know, use it or lose it. But it's considered a real emergency situation because of the risk for suspension trauma and hypothermia, which I've already gone over has happened several times during this episode. I would guess that may have been what some of the others who tried to help their friends get out and were not able to were trying to do. But Q made it. He successfully got X down the rope and back to the bottom of the pit. Then he climbed back up and out of Fantastic Pit, and then another 125 feet up the warm-up pit before leaving Ellison's cave and calling for help. Multiple rescue teams consisting of 45 rescuers rushed to the cave. About 26 of them entered the cave, and when some made it to Fantastic Pit, they noticed the rope X and Q were using was rigged in a strange spot. Because the rope was in the waterfall, and it was severely degraded where it rubbed against the edge of the pit. The rescuers actually said even if X did not become ill and was able to climb out of the pit, the rope probably would have broken on Q when he used it after, from the additional use of a second person. But the rescuers continued and got down to X and rigged their own equipment and followed procedure accordingly. By the time they made it to X, he was so hypothermic at the bottom of Fantastic Pit that he started removing his clothing. When people are suffering from hypothermia and start undressing, it's called paradoxical undressing. I spoke about this a bit in my episode on the Dyatlov Pass, which I'll link in the show notes, but essentially, in moderate and severe hypothermia cases, blood vessels start to contract as the body loses heat. They do that to keep the heat near the body's core and vital organs. Eventually, the muscle that contracts the blood vessels gets tired and relaxes, and the warm blood starts flowing back into the extremities. That makes the person it's happening to feel hot all of a sudden. And with their mental clarity already compromised, the person going through these symptoms doesn't realize how dangerous taking off their clothes is when they start doing it. Luckily, rescuers were able to get X dressed again and gave him food and water. They were able to convince him to get up and walk around, move a bit, and warm up. Then they put him in a harness and got him out of the pit. The entire time, rescuers were pushing him to continue moving around and stay awake. The entire rescue operation took about 6 hours, and X left the cave around 12:45 p.m. He was rushed to a hospital by ambulance. Luckily, X, being as young as he was and physically fit, plus rescuers getting there when they did, all allowed X the chance to survive and recover. And let's not forget Q getting him off the rope and out of the waterfall. Now, both X and Q were experienced climbers, but had zero caving experience. Ellison's cave is one of the most popular caving locations in America, but it is not for beginners. Only experienced cavers should be attempting to explore inside, as demonstrated by all of these stories. And honestly, if you're watching the video version, you've probably seen pictures of the inside and the entrance. I can't imagine not knowing what I'm doing and still deciding to go inside of this cave. So let's have this be a lesson for everyone who wants to go visit Ellison's cave without experience. Please just don't do it. If you like this episode, be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss more like this, and leave a comment or review depending on where you're listening from on which incident in Ellison's cave shocked you the most. Stay safe, and thanks for listening. Again, I'm Tatiana Bunch, and I'll be back next Thursday.